Hey everybody, what is going on? Hexlex here. I got another Master Duel video for you. So, finally coming back to Branded Despia. It's been a hot minute since I've covered this deck, but I've had some comments asking me to lately, and on top of that, even though Branded Despia isn't a deck that I typically play, it's not in my rotation of decks I normally like to cycle between if I'm, if I'm dueling just kind of on my own merit and not like trying to get games for a video or whatever, then yeah, I mean, there are a lot of decks that I would go to before Branded Despia. Not that I dislike this deck by any means, it's just like, you know, there's a ton of valid decks out there, and only so much time to cover them all. The other thing about Branded Despia, too, that I noticed the more, time goes on and the more complex this deck gets, is that Branded Despia is one of those decks where, like, yeah, you could pick it up and with even just a bit of knowledge about the deck still get a net positive win rate on ladder, but to really and truly excel with a deck like Branded Despia, you gotta main it. It's gotta be, like, the deck you focus on the most, because like more so than a lot of other decks in the format right now, this deck in particular really rewards knowledge of how all the interactions play out and how a typical Branded Despia game plays out, because this is one of those decks where rather than setting up a combo line, your plays a lot of the time are going to end up setting up a resource loop. Now, what I mean when I say a resource loop is that a lot of these card effects have effects that will either bring themselves back to your hand or field during the end phase, or will either allow you to add or set another card to the field or to your hand during the end phase there. Prime examples, of course, include Albion. The Branded Dragon is the biggest one, being able to set any branded spell or trap card from your deck or add it to your hand during the end phase. Cartesia is another one. Young Cartesia, wheeling herself back to your hand as long as a fusion monster goes to the graveyard. Branded High Spirits is another one that adds itself back to your hand. So when you're making these plays, right, when you're playing Branded Despia in general, you can't just be thinking about the turn that you're currently playing. You gotta be playing for the current turn as well as your next turn, and a lot of times you might even have to be thinking about, like, your next turn after that. Cartesia is another great example of that kind of mentality, right, where with Cartesia, you know, it's one thing to add her to plan on fusing with her that turn, but, you know, a truly skilled Branded Despia player would be thinking, like, okay, I need to add Cartesia and fuse with her this turn, but also make sure this gets into the graveyard, so that way she comes back to my hand during the end phase. That way during the next turn I have follow-up play to go into another Albion or whatever, with this other monster I'm going to be adding, or that will be in my hand, etc., etc., so on and so forth. Again, Branded Despia really, really rewards that kind of thinking, far more so than almost any other deck out there in the current meta. There is another deck that's pretty comparable, and it's another deck that I don't tend to cover too often, because I feel like these resource looping decks do really need a specialist in order to get the maximum value out of them, but we'll cover that other deck tomorrow. Today, like I said, we're focusing on Branded Despia. So when doing research for this build that I was putting together here, I noticed that nowadays it seems like almost every Branded Despia deck out there is 60 cards. Or at least a lot of the ones that I saw in Master Duel meta that were doing well in tournaments in particular, but also a lot of the ones that were doing well on ladder that are being submitted that have made it to, like, Master 1, for example. It definitely seems like 60 is the way to go. Even though Grass and Branded Fusion are both at 1, that might seem a little counterintuitive. It's like, why would you want your deck to be the maximum count if, you know, 2 of your arguably most important spell cards are both at 1? Well, we do play a set of Triple Tactics Thrust to help out with that. That will obviously, as long as the opponent has a monster on the field, definitely grab one of your power spell cards. But setting up the Branded Fusion in particular is definitely not too hard. We not only, of course, have the Alubers to add them, but nowadays I think the more common way to set up the Branded Fusion is to get it into the graveyard with Saronir or Quem, and then use again, the other Saronir or Quem, whichever one you didn't use first, to set up the Branded Retribution in the graveyard, and then, using the Retribution effect to add the Branded Fusion back into your head. Albion, the Shrouded Dragon, is another great example of a card that can do that, that can help set that up in the graveyard. In that regard, I think it is actually definitely worth having the second Retribution. It's kind of, I guess, from what I can tell, looking at lists, a little bit 50-50, whether or not people play 1 or 2, but Granted, I have rather limited experience with the deck, but in my opinion, it seems like, especially for more grindy games, having that second Retribution is definitely very, very helpful. Also, of course, this card is definitely not bad to just set as a counter trap, right? Of course, it has the ability to negate any kind of effect that would special summon a monster, which is quite a few of them. So, you don't even necessarily have to have a fusion monster on the field. You can put back 2 fusion monsters that are in your graveyard as well. So, yeah, definitely worth thinking about in that regard. I've noticed too where in the past a lot of Branded Despia builds have been kind of lighter on hand traps. For example, and this is still true, not every Branded Despia build plays a set of Ash Blossom. I do think that we are absolutely in a format where having these hand traps is pretty crucial. So I like having the set of Ashes as well as the set of Drolls. And then also Super Poly. I talked recently in my Best of 1 versus Best of 3 video about hand traps versus board breakers, but I did note a couple of board breakers in particular that are particularly effective in a Best of 1 because they can also be used as disruption if you go first. Super Poly, of course, definitely being one of them. Even if you go first, you can always just set this, and obviously if you go second, your opponent's going to have, naturally, a lot of the time, quite a few things for you to fuse. Main target here is going to be Garura, but of course the Dragostapelia is definitely not too difficult to make either. As far as the extra deck goes, I think the main thing I am missing is, honestly, another potential Super Poly target, and that is going to be the Borreload Furious Dragon. Let me go ahead and just show you, yeah, for reference, which card I'm talking about. This card is a UR, I don't have it crafted, and like I said before, Branded Despia is not the kind of deck that I'm playing very, very often at all, so that's the main reason why I haven't crafted it. But if you're serious about playing Branded Despia, then I would highly recommend getting this card. 2 Dark Dragons is not at all a difficult fusion material requirement. Again, sometimes you can even get that off of fusing your opponent's stuff with Super Poly, but yeah, I mean, it's just generally a good effect, and I can definitely see why the majority of Branded Despia decks are on the Borreload Furious Dragon. I've got the Verd Anaconda, which is kind of like, you know, it occasionally comes up if you get disrupted enough and you just end on 2 random monsters. Like, okay, well, I can still maybe Anaconda to send the Branded Fusion, right? But at the same time, it's also like, I don't know. It's definitely very replaceable. I mainly have this in here because I do not have the Borreload Furious Dragon there. Otherwise, I like pretty much everything else in the extra deck. Titaniclad, I know not everyone has it, or at least, you know, it's one of those earlier branded support cards that a lot of people might have dusted or passed up on, but you do need it. You do need Titaniclad, because, of course, Quem is always treated as a Dogmatica card, and a Titaniclad can summon out a Dogmatica monster, or Albaz. So being able to pull out Quem with the Titaniclad, I do think ends up being rather important there. Oh, and we are also playing a couple of cards that are particularly for the thrust as well. The Imperm, I know I said before I like having a lot of hand traps in general, but I don't think you need Imperm for Branded Despia. It's literally just here to set off of thrust. Another big one that I like setting off of thrust is the Fusion Duplication. There's a lot of times where, like, if your Branded Fusion gets ashed, but you're holding onto the thrust, then you can just use the thrust to set up the Fusion Duplication, and then flip that up on your opponent's turn, and then fuse out from there. So, I mean, otherwise I think I'm doing pretty much a lot of the typical stuff you would expect to see from Branded Despia. Oh, Albion, the Shrouded Dragon, much like the Branded Retribution, I could absolutely see having a second copy to make setting up the Branded Fusion just a lot more consistent in general. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and break this list down card by card, and then we'll see a few games playing this list that I'll show you here. So, we are on 3 Droll and Mockbird, 1 Despain Tragedy, 3 Maxx, 3 Ash Blossom and a Joyous Spring, 3 Fallen of Albaz, 2 Aluber the Jester of Despia, 2 Tri-Brigade Mercourier, 1 Springans Kitt, 2 Blazing Cartesia, the Virtuous, 2 Guiding Quem, the Virtuous, 1 Bystial Magnamhut, 3 Bystial Saronir, 1 Bystial Druiswarm, 1 Albion the Shrouded Dragon, 1 the Bystial Lubellion, 1 Nibiru the Primal Being, 1 Foolish Burial, 1 Golden Sarcophagus, 1 That Grass Looks Greener, 3 Fusion Deployment, 1 Triple Tactics Talent, 1 Branded in White, 1 Branded Fusion, 3 Triple Tactics Thrust, 1 Branded Lost, 1 Branded Regained, 3 Super Polymerization, 2 Call by the Grave, 1 Crossout Designator, 2 Branded Opening, 2 Branded in High Spirits, 1 Branded in Red, 1 Infinite Impermanence, 1 Branded Banishment, 1 Fusion Duplication, 1 Branded Retribution, and then finally 1 Branded Beast. And that'll be our 60 card main deck. Now for our extra deck we are on, 1 Guerrero, Wings of Restorant Life, 1 Predaplant Dragostapelia, 1 Titaniclad the Ash Dragon, 1 Sprind the Iron Dash Dragon, 2 Albion the Branded Dragon, 1 Despian Coritis, 2 Mirajade the Iceblade Dragon, 1 Lubellion the Searing Dragon, 1 Granganol the Dusk Dragon, 1 Rindbum the Striking Dragon, 1 Albion the Sanctifier Dragon, 1 Guardian Chimera, and then finally 1 Predaplant Vert Anaconda. And that will do it for our list. Let's go ahead and see these duels. Okay, our first opponent is going to be on Dynamorphia. Definitely been seeing a noticeable increase of play of this deck ever since they got not only the secret pack, but of course the Dynamorphia alert within that secret pack. Very, very strong card for an already pretty good deck, honestly. We're taking the first turn here. Going to start by opening up with the Springans Kitt. Opponent is going to use the Ash Blossom against that right there. Now that will ultimately be enough to stop the adding of Branded Fusion right here and now. However, I can still use Fusion Deployment to add the summon the Cartesia. We're going to use Cartesia's effect here, fusing her with the Kitt in order to summon Granganol. I can't go for Albion, of course, because we don't have Albaz as a material, but I can use that to set up the Branded Fusion into the graveyard there, the Albion. Now I can thrust to set the use the triple tactics thrust rather to set the Fusion Duplication, set Super Poly, and then pass. I do also have another interaction here, potentially. I'm not necessarily looking to use Fusion Duplication as soon as possible, because I could potentially use Super Poly on my opponent's stuff, discard Retribution, and then use Retribution to add the Branded Fusion for follow-up. One thing to remember about Fusion Duplication is that it will end up banishing your Branded Fusion. And while having your Branded Fusion banished is not necessarily the end of the duel for you as a Branded player, it will make follow-up plays more difficult. So definitely try to keep that card in the graveyard if possible. Again, I am looking to Super Poly before Fusion Duplication, if at all possible here. But it's going to start with the Dynamorphia Therizia, setting the domain there, and then 3 other cards. So right off the bat, you'll notice I allowed my opponent to move to the end phase, because I know they're not going to be doing anything else on this turn here. And indeed, we're just going to move past into my turn. Again, I'm not concerned about firing off the Fusion Duplication on my opponent's turn. You might be tempted to here. You might be tempted to use this before your opponent has a chance to respond with anything, but I do think that it's ultimately better to wait. Drawing another Super Poly, and the opponent's going to fire off a Maxx as well. The second Super Poly, this might look like a really bad draw, but I think this was actually a phenomenal draw here. It might look bad because it's like, oh, the opponent's only got 1 monster and we already have a Super Poly. How good is this going to be, really? Well, of course, Dynamorphia is planning to use their trap cards to summon at least once, but probably multiple times during my turn. So having multiple Super Polys is definitely not that bad. Plus, I'm already seeing a line here where I can already use multiple Super Polys, right? If I use the Super Poly from hand and discard Branded Retribution, I can, again, use Retribution to wheel the Branded Fusion back to my hand. That will lead to potentially use that, but if I really need to Super Poly, I can pitch the Branded Fusion for the second Super Poly, and then still use it with Fusion Duplication. So, again, although this is a rather niche example of it, keeping in mind not only what resources you have available, but the order that you need to activate them in order to make sure that you have, a long-term game plan is very, very crucial. So, turning Granganol to attack mode, threatening to move the battle phase, they're going to flip up the domain as well as the frenzy. Both of these are 100% fine with me. I am a-okay with that. So, Kent Regina coming down, and then the Frenzy will send the one from the extra deck as well in order to summon out the Dynamorphia Rexsturm. But like I said, I can just use my Super Poly. I'm going to pitch the Retribution. I'm going to fuse the Kent Regina and the Rexsturm for the Predaplant Dragostapelia. It's also very important that we're using the correct Super Poly target first. Right? In this particular situation, I can go for Dragostapelia or Garura, but I want to go for Dragostapelia now because all of Dynamorphia's stuff are going to be Dark Dinosaurs, so Garura is really easy to make in that regard. But Dragostapelia obviously needs a fusion monster, which they might not necessarily always have, so I want to make that first. Now here they do get to use the new card, Dynamorphia Alert. This will allow them to, by paying out their life points, bring back up to 2 of their Dynamorphias with total levels equal 8 or less. Now, the Rextrum being level 8 is going to being the only thing that ends up coming back here, but it makes sense why my opponent wanted to bring back Rextrum, because while this is in play, it's really hard for me to activate monster effects or declare an attack. And also, using Dragos Depelia to try to put a counter on the Rextrum, even if I could, wouldn't work, because Dragos Depelia's counter that only negates activated effects, and this is a continuous effect. However, as I touched upon earlier, I can use Retribution, wheel the Fusion back to my hand, then Super Poly Pitch Branded Fusion, and I'll fuse my opponent's remaining 2 cards in order to summon the Garura. And of course, Dynamorphia being the deck they are, they're already at low enough life points, so I can swing in with anything for lethal. But again, if I needed to, if that last face down card was, like, let's say it was a Ferret Flames, right, that ate my whole board, I still could have flipped up Fusion Deployment to banish Branded Fusion and then use that to get my damage for lethal on board. So, again, yeah, this in particular is a very niche case example of it. It's not the traditional kind of resource loops you would do with, like, Cartesia or an Albion and all that fun stuff, but Branded Despia, more so than any other deck, it's so important to be keeping the next turn in mind whenever you're setting up plays. But that's just one game. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one here. Okay, this next duel is going to be against Makonko. And it seemed like a relatively standard list, except that they were on some incantation cards. I don't think they were normally on incantation stuff in Makonko. So here I lost the coin flip, but opponent let me go first. So Makonko was kind of the first thing I was thinking. Nowadays, if my opponent lets me go first, it's better to assume Makonko over, like, Numeron, for example. But I am still kind of in the back of my head thinking about, like, going second to Kashtira is not completely uncommon either. So, but it is probably just going to be Makonko. Anyway, here, yeah, opening double Albaz is pretty annoying. But what I'm going to end up doing here is just going for the Lubellion off of the Albion. That way I can still set up the Bystial Lubellion in the graveyard to, yeah, sack off the Albion and set up the search there. I have the Mirror Jade established. I have a Branded Beast for more interaction. And of course I'm going to use Albion here. We'll use it to set up the Branded Red to potentially summon a Guardian Chimera. So, yeah, I mean, again, given how awkward our opening hand was, well, relatively speaking, of course, we did have the Branded Fusion there. And the Albion ended up drawing us, what, the Called By and sending the Retribution. So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think all things considered, this was a fine kind of pivot for the Branded Fusion there. Of course, I would not at all be surprised if a Branded Expert came in and be like, oh, yeah, no, with this kind of setup, you actually could have had, like, even more, like, another resource or another Disrupt or whatever, but... Like, I'm thinking about if I had sent Cartesia, right, instead of Bystial Lubellion, but at the same time, having Branded Beast established is... Well, the other thing, too, is, like I said, I knew that I was probably going to be up against Makonko, so I think having Branded Beast as a Disrupt is better in that kind of situation a lot of the times than having Cartesia as a resource sleep. Maybe. But anyway, they have the Lava Golem. That's obviously going to be pretty annoying, but if nothing else, we get to fire off the Mirror Jade Death. Adding the Ohime with prep there. We're going to use Ohime's effect in order to add Great Makonko Ceremony, discarding Ben 10, looks like. Ceremony will be used to summon out the Ohime from hand. That's fine, and then we can send... I think that's the one that bounces, right? Abereska? Yeah, that's the one that... Or Aberesk, rather. That's the one that bounces, so... I'll let them battle. It's only 3k damage, so I'm not really concerned about it at all. And yeah, I'm absolutely going to fire off the Guardian Chimera here. Even if I can't necessarily destroy the Ohime by card effect. Oh no, I can, that's right. It can't be destroyed by battle. I don't know why I always forget that, but... For some reason I always assume this thing can't be destroyed by card effect too, but... Okay, here's some of the incantation line. Wheeling back the Ben 10 to hand. Before, yeah, the Mirror Jade is going to end up wiping the board. So, other nice thing about Branded in Red is that the limitation that says the Fusion Summon monster cannot attack directly is only for that turn, meaning this Guardian Chimera is free to battle as much as I would like it to. Retribution, we're going to use that to wheel the Branded Fusion back to hand. Again, that's why I used Albion during my first turn to send the Retribution, even if I didn't plan on using the effect right away. Always got to have that follow-up plan. Branded Fusion, I'm going to send Albaz and Cartesia before using the Albion effect, banishing Albaz and Mirror Jade for another Mirror Jade. Yeah, I didn't have to think too hard here. I mean, just one simple Retribution for Fusion is going to be enough to end up having enough damage on the board. But, again, I had the access to the Branded Fusion because turn 1 I used Albion and sent it to send the Branded Retribution. It's not really important to do that on turn 1 because you might argue, like, well, couldn't you have waited and just done it the next turn? And, like, yeah, I could have, but you're also getting deck thinning in there, which, especially in your deck of 60 cards, to be fair, is not necessarily a whole lot of thinning, only one card, but every little bit counts, and just making sure that we have that established in the yard is definitely good. Plus, the Retribution is a quick effect, so even if the opponent had threatened to banish the Branded Fusion out of my graveyard, which is not uncommon with more people taking DD Crow for Super Heavy Samurai, DD Crow also very good against this deck for banishing Branded Fusion out of the graveyard. But again, Retribution is a quick effect, so even if that had been the case, I could have just chained Retribution and added it back to hand. But we do have one more duel to see. Let us go into that now. And our final opponent is going to be against Nimlaria. And keep in mind, this is Master Rank, so while granted, it's not like, you know, Master Rank is being swept by Nimlaria, running into a lot more Nimlarias in Master than a lot of people might expect. The deck is good. It's definitely a good deck. I could use Branded and High Spirits here, but opponent's going to immediately fire off the Dimension Shifter. This does make a lot of what I would like to set up here a lot more awkward, namely the Bystial Saronir and all that fun stuff, right? I end up discarding Albion Sanctifier just to, like, not have to send anything else. That might have been the wrong send, but... And then Thrust for Imperm, because, like, I didn't know what else to really bother setting up here. But it's going to summon out an Eater of Millions. At this point, I figured it was probably Nimlaria. If not Nimlaria, some kind of, like, stun deck, right? But Eater of Millions, to me, is an indicator for Nimlaria. So here I'm going to use Foolish for the Despain Tragedy. I'll use that to add the Aluber. And I'm just going to try to normal summon Aluber and see if I can't just grab the Branded Fusion. That does actually manage to resolve Aluber's effect, but yeah. They're just saving the Ash Blossom for the Branded Fusion itself. Which, I mean, to be fair, most people typically do anyway. I do still think that is correct, the vast majority of the time. Very, very occasionally, there are some situations where it might not be okay. And also, yeah, lol, me not reading cards, not knowing that Eater of Millions could just banish the Aluber if I battled with it. Whoops, my bad. So, losing Aluber for no reason is not great, but it's definitely not the end of the world by any means. Gonna normal summon Quem. Quem's gonna get Ash Blossomed, that's fine, I don't care. Also think that was a fine Ash Blossom for the opponent because... of course, the Branded Fusion is already in the yard. Well, no, actually, I had the Tragedy, though. I forgot about that. So that was not a fine Ash Blossom. At all, actually. Yeah, I don't really know what that was all about, now that I think about it. Especially after they saved it for the Branded Fusion before. I guess they just forgot about Tragedy's graveyard effect. Which, to be fair, I did for a moment there as well, but yeah, here I'm just going to send Albaz and Lubellion for Albion. When I saw them send him along, I knew they were just going to end up, you know, obviously bouncing the Lubellion, but if we're still able to get in, you know, a Fusion Summon here, there's no reason not to. I decided to go for Lubellion just to set up the Albaz, or to set up the Mirror Jade here. Because I didn't want to have to imperm the Eater of Millions just to battle over it if I didn't have to. Plus, Maxx is, like, not that useful against the Nimlaria as a whole, so, yeah. I figured this would probably be fine. I don't have a card to discard for Super Poly now, but I don't think that's that big of a deal. I have the Branded Banishment anyway, so between the Impermanent Banishment, I think we'll probably be fine. Dogmatica, Cartesia coming down, adding another Dogmatica Punishment. That's pretty annoying, but it's whatever. Glad I did not imperm that, though, because I would definitely rather imperm the Eater of Millions here. Okay, they are finally summoning their first Nimlaria monster here, the Dreaming Reality of Nimlaria. And yeah, because we chained imperm to the attack, now they have to battle into it anyway. And I guess at that point, they just were out of resources. To be fair, on the next turn, I'm able to use Mirror Jade's effect to banish again. So if they can't out the Mirror Jade here, I can just out more of their stuff. And the duel, it definitely, as the duel goes on, it becomes more and more difficult for them to win in this spot in particular. So yeah, those are our games with Branded Despia. Hope you all enjoyed it, and tomorrow, again, look forward to another deck that I typically don't cover too often, that is also all about setting up resource loops. But That'll be it for this one. Thanks again. Let us now move on to the outro.